Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is the Science-Based Target Initiative webinar on ambition, growth, and evolution of the initiative. And we're very happy and pleased to have you all on this webinar today. My name is Lila Karbassi. I'm with the United Nations Global Compact, and I currently chair the executive board of the SBTi. Our event today will be conducted in English, and we also have interpretation in Spanish, Portuguese, and French. You can select the language of your choice on the bottom of your screen. Our event today is taking place during London Climate Action Week. We're broadcasting live as a Zoom webinar and also on YouTube, and the recording will be available on YouTube after the event. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and our team will do its best to respond to all of the questions that you have in writing. For today, I'm very pleased to be joined by the SBTi CEO, Luiz Amaral, as well as Chief Technical Officer and co-founder, Alberto Carrillo. We will take you through the presentation and we will have a short Q&A session also after the presentation live with all of you. I would like to start us with a couple of polls just to get an idea of who's in the room with us today. We've had over 3,500 people registered, and I can see that people are still joining and logging to the webinar. And we've had people registered from 80 countries around the world, which is very impressive. So let's get started with a quick poll to just get an idea of the population we have in the room right now. So you have a couple of questions to choose from. What type of organization you represent? Where are you based? And what are you looking for to learn in this webinar? And as we receive your responses to the poll, I would just like to remind you that the webinar is recorded, and again, you'll be able to watch it on a YouTube channel after the event. And we have behind the scenes colleagues from across the SBTi who will be answering many of the questions that you have. If we don't get the opportunity to cover all of the questions, we will do our best to post them later on and to get back to you in writing later on. So let's see if we have some responses to the polls. First of all, we have more than half of the participants today from business, followed by consultancy firms. So that's very encouraging. It's great to see also the participation from NGOs, academia, government, and industry associations. So welcome to all and great to have you. Let's see if we have the response to the second poll and see where everyone is located. Okay, can you put that back again, please? Can you put the poll about where people are located back again, please? And also, can you put the third poll out in the meantime, so we can see what people are interested in, if you have that? If not, we can come back to that a little bit later. With that, and I see more people are joining, so we're probably getting a really good representation from companies and others around the world. So with that, I'm very, very pleased to introduce SBTi's new CEO, Luiz Amaral. Luiz joined just a couple of months ago. We're very happy to have him on board. Over to you, Luiz.
Well, thank you so very much, Lila. Thank you so very much for everybody that is participating. It's an honor to be here and talking to folks that is very interested in working with us all over the world. Well, first, let me just briefly introduce myself. My name is Luiz Amaral, and I joined SBTi in February. I'm now celebrating about 100 days with the initiative. Before my time here, my career can be divided into 4 phases: civil society, finance sector, industry, and research and academia. The last 5 years were in civil society sector, as I joined from the World Resources Institute, where I led work on more sustainable global supply chains. Before that, I spent the previous 1/4 of my career working on the finance sector, leading ESG risk for a major bank in Latin America. Before that, I spent 5 years on the real economy, leading sustainability for a food and agricultural industry. And at the very beginning of my career, I was working with research in universities. I've had the opportunity to serve on boards of governmental funds investing in climate change, and have also served on boards of standard-setting bodies auto-regulating markets. None of this was planned when I was a young person, by the way. My original goal was to be an architect. I was in the 3rd year of architecture school when I decided to quit and had to start all over studying international relations and economics, as I needed to do something with a global impact. So although I've always worked in sustainability, I've worked in different kinds of roles, different kinds and different roles for different organizations. And having sat on different sides of the table, working on different types of actors, but usually around the same issues, I have learned 3 things. 1, it's not just governments that can change the world. Don't get me wrong, they are absolutely needed. But the private sector also has a huge role to play and is often leading business that move first, which also then drives policy changes. 2, people have different ways of tackling problems, but the outcome they're looking for is often the same, even if they use different languages, different jargons, different strategic approaches. So to unlock cooperation and positive action, those folks don't need only a mediator, they need a translator, somebody that can work across those boundaries, translate common goals into a language that all understand, help them understand where they can make the greatest impacts, the biggest bang for the buck, because no one can solve every problem alone. And when it comes to tackling the biggest problem the world has ever seen, we must draw on the power of partnerships. 3rd, and finally, what gets measured gets managed. Proper due process is essential for success. We need to define and quantify what success looks like from the outset, whatever it is that we want to change. Otherwise, our efforts become a storytelling competition. And all of that can only happen with proper due process. I could not be more excited to be in SBTi because I really believe we check all of those 3 boxes. We drive ambitious corporate climate action. We convene and translate science into guidance and standards. And we facilitate measurement of success with proper due process. The SBTi has achieved a huge amount in a very few years. It really has started to change the world, but I'm not satisfied. If we want to tackle the devastating effects of climate change to create a more sustainable world, there's much more that we all must do. And we must do a lot must do that better. And that's true for SBTi itself, and I want to be very honest about it. Today, our goal is to share our journey with you, show where we were, identify where we are, and indicate where we're going. To begin our story, over one of SBTi's very own architects, my colleague who needs no introduction for many, and who is the very heart and soul of SBTi, a very warm welcome to our Chief Technical Officer, Alberto Carrillo.
Thank you, Luis, and thanks everyone for joining us today, for your generous time. I'm very happy to be speaking to you today and to share a little bit more about the journey that SBTi has followed so far and that has brought us to where we are today. SBTi started as a dream that the world's most relevant corporate actors would set climate targets in line with what science said was necessary. This was in 2014, before COP21, before the Paris Agreement. And back then, what we heard from companies, from people in our sphere was that this was not feasible. But this was a very solid concept that had already been tested by some of the pioneers in the business sector. And it's a concept that was endorsed by some of the world's largest and more respected organizations, including CDP, UN Global Compact, WRI, WWF, and the Women Business Coalition. And they really helped change the narrative and the paradigm about how companies set climate targets. We launched our first call to action in 2015 with the aim of getting 100 companies committed to set science-based targets by COP21. And we didn't expect that what started as a concept would grow into a movement. In the run-up to COP26 last year, this flow became a cascade, and we entered into a period of exponential growth. And this growth has been a pattern for SBTi, but also evolution has been a pattern for SBTi. We started setting a framework for companies to set targets based on 2-degree scenarios. That was the best science that was available when we started. Today, we are shifting towards 1.5 degrees, and that has become the central ambition in SBTi. We started with much more informal processes towards a robust professional organization, working with a handful of individuals that were working on a part-time basis at the beginning of SBTi, to having a full-time secretariat with more than 50 full-time experts that, as you will hear, we're planning to double in size. And from a voluntary climate ambition initiative that was new at the time to being recognized today as the de facto standard for climate ambition in the business sector. And this is not the end of our evolution. This is just the start. I want to hand back to Lila, and she's going to tell us about where we are today.
Great, thanks, Alberto. And I want to recognize the achievements of SBTi in the past couple of years, but also talk about the need for the initiative to evolve if it is to retain its position as a leader on corporate climate action. So I'm going to reflect on where we are now and some of the milestones from the past year. There are over 3,000 businesses that have now committed to set science-based targets. Almost half of them have submitted their targets, which have been approved as being aligned with science. And there's evidence that companies with validated targets are delivering absolute emissions reductions at scale. Between 2015 and 2020, companies with approved targets cut emissions within their operations by 29%. And even looking at the impact of the pandemic, SBTi companies are continuing to cut emissions even faster than their peers. And what's remarkable is that they're cutting emissions faster than what is needed to align with 1.5. So that gives us a lot of hope for the future. The vast majority of companies working with the SBTi are committing to and setting targets aligned with 1.5 degree. And this is why from mid-July on, businesses setting new targets will only be able to set near-term targets aligned with 1.5. The net zero tracker shows that more than 90% of global GDP is now committed to net zero. But not all net zero targets are equal. The definition of net zero and the path to get there varies and is often inconsistent. And this is why we created the standard, the net zero standard. It gives a common, a robust, and a science-based understanding of corporate net zero. It gives business leaders clarity, confidence that their near-term, long-term decarbonization plans are actually aligned with climate science, and it would help us get us to where we need to be. The net zero standard includes both near-term 1.5 targets and long-term net zero targets. And the ultimate goal is to achieve absolute emissions reductions of around 90%, depending on the sector, by 2050. The remaining 10% should be neutralized with high quality removals. And throughout the process, companies are encouraged to invest in what we call beyond value chain mitigation. And this is as long as they're peaking their emissions. So all of these investments do not count for the purposes of absolute emissions reductions. However, they are very welcome, and we encourage for that to happen. We'll talk about this a bit later also. The net zero standard was launched just before COP26, and the response has been extraordinary. Over 1,000 companies are now committed to science-based net zero with the standard, and those companies are already starting to develop their targets and submitting them for validation. We expect actually many more to come in the coming months. At the COP26, we also saw a major commitment from the financial institutions with more than $100 trillion in assets under management towards the purpose of reaching a state of net zero before 2050. And again, to ensure consistency and a common understanding of the net zero target, landscaping, we also need a standard for that purpose. So last year, the SBTi launched the SBTi finance framework, which will do just that. It supports financial institutions, including banks, investors, insurance companies, pension funds, to set targets aligning lending and investment practices with the Paris Agreement. So as part of this, we're working with the financial sector to develop the net zero standard for financial institutions, and we're aiming to launch the standard in the first part of 2023. We believe that it will be a game changer for financial institutions, the same way that the net zero standard was for corporations. Now, in order for the SBTi to move into its next phase of growth, a lot of things need to happen, and the initiative needs to evolve. In a second, Luis will talk about the changes we're introducing today. All of these changes have the full support from the executive board. The first step in this evolution and the foundation for the changes to come is actually the appointment of Luis as the first CEO of SBTi. We're delighted to have him on board, and under his leadership, the SBTi has a strong future ahead. Luis, over to you.
Well, thank you so very much, Lila, and thank you for the whole SBTi executive board for the trust and support. So we heard today Alberto talk about where we were. Lila told you about where we are. Now I want to talk a little bit about what our future holds. So I want to talk to you about three things. Well, actually 6 things. I'm going to talk about one opportunity. How can we reach critical mass to stop the clock on climate change, the biggest challenge the world has ever faced? Then I want to talk to you about 2 challenges to overcome and how we're tackling them. And then I want to talk about 3 priorities to unlock SBTi's full potential. So first, one opportunity to reach critical mass. If the world is to avoid the most catastrophic effects of climate change and keep global heating below 1.5 degrees, the window of opportunity is quickly closing. Warnings from science are crystal clear. This is the biggest existential crisis we face, and we come against a backdrop of significant global economic issues including the global pandemic, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and potential food crisis. These huge global challenges mean that it's even more imperative for us to take radical and immediate action to cut emissions. The importance cannot be stressed enough. We are in code red for humanity. We know that the work we are doing is critical, but we must all play our part and work together to go further, faster, and that includes governments, businesses, and the SBTi itself. We must all seize the opportunity to change the trajectory of global temperature increases. Our theory of change is based on the diffusion of innovations theory. What that means is you need between 10 to 25% of a system's members to adopt an innovation to trigger rapid adoption by the other members. And that's valid for everything, for any innovation they're trying, from cell phones to new technologies. At the SBTi, we work with the assumption that 20%, 1/5 of business in a particular territory or sector equals critical mass. That's a tipping point in which it becomes increasingly difficult for others to do nothing. So more and more joining this race to the top. So if you really want to stop the clock on climate change, we must reach this tipping point, and fast. By 2025, we need to get what I like to call the 1 in 5 challenge. So by 2025, for us, SBTi, we need to have the most important businesses involved, the ones that can reshape the economy. Assuming a market cap about $90 to $100 trillion, 1 in 5 means $20 trillion. We also need to get to this tipping point in terms of emissions covered. That's a different KPI. We're about 5% gigatons of global corporate emissions. Finally, we need to get the 1 in 5 of the world's most important companies. Assuming that we are about 40 to 45 listed companies in the world, we have set 10K as our target. So how are we doing against those targets? As per our annual progress report, already businesses representing more than 1/3 of the global economy, $38 trillion, have at least committed to science-based targets. So we have achieved that goal for commitments. Now we need to get those which have been making commitments but have not yet set targets to also set targets as soon as possible. We have not been able to measure that KPI for the validated piece of it, of that group, but we will. In December 2021, we already had 1.5 gigatons of emissions covered by validated targets. It is about 30% of the 5 gigaton goal. Note that we could only measure it for scope 1 and 2 emissions, and only for 80% of the sample that we had, given data availability. So it's probably underestimated. We also could not measure it for all of committed companies, given a lack of data, but we did for the ones that had been validated. Finally, we have today around 3,200 companies with commitments, which translates about 30% of that tipping point, and around 1,500 with validate targets, which is about 15% of that goal. But I believe we can do this. There's will out there. You're all being involved here shows that, from both businesses, but from all of us here on SBTi. But in order to achieve that, there are 2 key challenges that we need to overcome. First, we as SBTi have faced a demand and growth-related challenges. The first event I did representing SBTi was a panel discussion called, "Is scrutiny the cost of leadership and transparency for companies?" At the time, I said yes. But that's true for ourselves too, because constructive challenges and scrutiny are essential for any thriving, growing organization. And that's the ethos in which I want to lead the SBTi. Feedback and challenge are essential for evolution and growth. There will always be difference of opinion, and that's healthy. As we as an initiative aren't going to get everything right, and that's why we should never shy away from healthy debate. That is why we're currently hiring a director of compliance who is responsible for ensuring compliance with policies and procedures with the initiative, between other things, implementing formal complaints mechanisms and other governance enhancements that will be announced in a minute. So we're taking action in some of these healthy suggestions that we had. As I said, transparency is important. to me, and I believe to be a core value of SBTi and how we work. Another good problem that we had related to growth is that in 2021, SBTi received more commitments from businesses than all the previous 6 years combined. Why would this pose a challenge? Well, as I said, this is a good problem to have. Any institution facing this type of success is going to face growth-related challenges. You can see that with companies producing the latest video game or innovators in electric cars, which have faced demand-driven challenges. So such surge in demand would inevitably put pressure on our day-to-day operations. Around COP26, hundreds of businesses were making commitments or clamoring to get their targets validated. At one point, demand rose so much that in January 2022, it looked like somebody would have to wait up for a year to get their target validated. That's what exponential growth looks like. That's how the great interest has become. But obviously, that was not acceptable. Within 3 months from that peak, we had already halved the waiting time. 3 months later, we halved it again. Today, if you log in, you get a day to get the targets validated in October. That is good reduction, but again, not enough. We have already delivered a 70% reduction compared to that one peak in January, which is no longer the case, but we want to go further. Our goal is that businesses should wait no longer than 1 month to get their target validated schedule, and we're significantly increasing capacity to make this happen. And I'd like to highlight that things have not slowed down. On the contrary, they're accelerating. By the end of the year, we'll have validated more targets than the previous 6 years combined. As a matter of fact, this year alone, we have validated a third of all science-based targets ever approved. So we are tackling growth-related challenges in a context in which growth is actually accelerating. The second challenge I want to put to you is how we can help and work with others from defining ambition, but also moving and supporting impact. The SBTi goal is to move corporate climate ambition from doing something to tackle climate change into doing enough, aligned with what science tells us is needed. But how? First, we need to know what the plan is, right? As I said, if we don't set those plans, if we don't define what success looks like, it's very hard to achieve them. Get clarity through the noise, standardize how targets are assessed. Without it, there's a risk of it all becoming a storytelling competition. And that's a very, very important value. And I think one of the most important values that SBTi brings to the table. That is why we have focused on target setting, on the definition of a plan, on the definition of ambition that aligns with science. That is the system that we have developed over this past few years. But the whole system evolves, and we know that a plan is a start. Last month, we published our 2021 progress report. As Lila said, it shows that businesses with science-based targets are cutting emissions faster than those without it. And sometimes even faster than is needed to limit global heating to 1.5. That is a fantastic first indicator, but as an academic myself, I know correlation is not causation. As an initiative, we don't just need to constantly improve the science in our target setting, but we also need to consider how we better measure impacts. Other challenges also remain. For example, only half of the companies with validated targets actually disclose their emissions to, for example, CDP. As Alberto will discuss in a minute, we intend to have developed a measurement, reporting, and validation framework to help advance this agenda without replicating efforts by others on this ecosystem. We must, and we are overcoming those two challenges. And if SBTi is to help play its part in preventing the worst events of climate change, we're going to do even better. So finally, I wanted to discuss and announce with you 3 key things we're now currently working on to unlock SBTi's full potential. So we saw this one big opportunity that we have on our hands, reaching the tipping point. We looked at those 2 challenges that we have and how we're tackling them. And now I want to present the 3 priorities which relate to this objectives and to those challenges. These priorities are institutional strengthening. We're taking SBTi to the next level as an institution. Second one, technical completeness. Alberto is going to discuss a little bit more, but it's the idea that we created guidances, but we are slowly getting more and more idiosyncratic as we go into very specific sectors. And third, leveraging the ecosystem. So starting with institution strength, as I said, I'm a firm believer that strong institutions are key for success. I'm also a firm believer in due process, especially for an institution like ours. My appointment as SBTi first CEO was the first step on that direction. Now, we look outside the initiative to learn from other world-leading, world-changing organizations, not just in standards, but on the way we operate. We work with several external consultants who help us design this new structure. My aim is for SBTi to be among the best of the best. Good enough is not an option. So I wanted to make 4 announcements on how we're doing this. First, we're incorporating SBTi, linked but separate from our founding partners, CDP, World Resources Institute, WWF, and the United Nations Global Compact. We won't look any different from the outside world, and we will absolutely not be cutting our ties to those founding organizations. We are also welcoming the Women Business Coalition also as a partner. But we will be able to work more efficiently and effectively. We'll be able to get more stuff done in less time to respond to growth and challenges mentioned above with this incorporation. Second, we're expanding our executive board by adding additional expertise and diversity to our highest governing body. We have a fantastic board. I'm personally very grateful for all their support, skills, and expertise. They have get us where we are today, and they'll continue to get us there. But they also want and recognize that in a growing organization, we need to spread the workload. We want to invite more perspectives, and we want more people because there's a lot of work to do. We'll seek exceptional individuals who would act on their personal capacity in bringing wider expertise from different backgrounds. We'll look for individuals committed to our cause from different backgrounds, such as business, academia, climate justice, investors, regulators, and standard setters. High-level leaders and change makers of the world, we want you. Additional information will be shared in due course. This year, we intend to bring 3 to 4 new board members to our 5 existing ones. Our ideal board composition will be probably around 11 members. We'll follow best practice and grow the group in phases. Third point, we're creating a technical council. SBTi has a proven, sophisticated, and well-established process for creating standards and guidances. It includes the creation of technical papers, public consultation periods, creation of experts advisory groups. At the end of this process, we need a body that can recommend approval of this work, make the difficult calls based on scientific and real-world evidence. As we know in science, there's always evidence, but at some point, you need to make the calls based on that evidence. You'll hear more about this from Alberto. Finally, we're increasing our team capacity. As Alberto mentioned, we currently have more than 50 dedicated staff from diverse backgrounds in different countries, all of whom are extremely competent. They all made SBTi into the leaders today. So if anybody's to praise SBTi for any of its success, it's about that team. They're the ones that should get it, the current ones and the previous ones that have helped us on this journey. The problem is we cannot clone them. So we're looking for new team members to join, and that will probably help us double our size within the next year or so. Finally, we're restructuring our leadership team. Before, SBTi had a steering committee, which had representatives of different partner organizations. Now, we moved into an executive leadership team with senior executives only hosted by partners, but in charge of different departments. So Alex Buss joined our team in late 2021 as our Director of Operations and Finance. Alex has extensive international experience, including as Managing Director and Chief Financial Officer, working for both multinationals and not-for-profits. You can rest assured that under Alex's leadership, SBTi will become a very efficient machine in no time. We also welcomed Luisa Pastori, which recently joined as our Head of Communications, with wide expertise in launching and leading high-performing teams and leading through change. She will ensure we're telling you a story to the strongest way to ensure more business and financial institutions understands what science-based targets are, how to get there, and understand what those scientific and how we're translating science into real-world action. Finally, as you might see, we're also working to fill 2 leadership positions. A Chief Impact Officer, who will be responsible for engaging the highest emitting sectors worldwide and working with the ecosystem to make 1 + 1 = 3. Also, we're hiring a Director of Compliance, who will be in charge of ensuring the best-in-class processes, policies, and procedures are put in place or enhanced. At last, but by no means at least, you might have seen that Alberto has recently been appointed as our SBTi's first Chief Technical Officer. So in summary, here's how SBTi looks within our old governance structure. And here in blue, I highlight the key announcements I've made today. A new executive leadership structure, establishing a compliance department, expansion of SBTi board, and the creation of a technical council. Now I'll hand back to Alberto to talk about our second priority, technical completeness.
Thank you very much, Luis, and exciting to see all these changes in the initiative. And first of all, let me say something. As Chief Technical Officer, it is my responsibility, and it is the responsibility of the technical team of the initiative to ensure that the technical integrity remains of the highest order as it has been today. And to enable that, we are running out a new governance system, as Luis mentioned, and a new standards architecture to enable us to maintain watertight credibility and robustness as demand for science-based targets continues to grow. And so this is led by, first of all, the strong technical governance that we are implementing and the processes that provide the structures, the rules, and the procedures for us to follow to maintain credibility and robustness and to adhere to best practice for standard setting organizations. This is then followed by the strong scientific foundations that have always informed the work that we do in the SBTi and that underpin everything that we do, including the creation of scenarios and methods that inform science-based target setting. Then this leads to development of standards for all companies for setting short-term, long-term targets and also to assess progress against targets. And then these are tailored to basically enable the implementation of targets for different sectors of the economy. And this is basically how the architecture of different technical elements come together. Now, based on this architecture, we have already a very rich and exciting pipeline of technical developments. Let me start first with what we have already publicly available on our website, which are first the near-term standards for science-based targets for corporates and financial institutions that have been the basis of what SBTi does. Then the corporate net zero standard that, as Lila mentioned, was launched last year and has become really a game changer in terms of understanding net zero in the corporate sector. And then we have a number of sector-specific guidance available already, including for some of the key sectors, power, aviation, transport, apparel, private equity, and others. Now, let me talk about some of the sectoral guidance that we are in the process of finalizing. This includes guidance for the shipping sector, for the cement sector, and for forest, land use, and agriculture. We are very excited about these developments, and they are going to be finalized soon. And now let me tell you about what is in the pipeline in earlier phases. As Lila mentioned, we are working in the development of a net zero standard for financial institutions. We see this development also as a potential game changer. And then we are working on a number of sectoral developments, including oil and gas, iron and steel, buildings, and then some of the additional methods that will inform and strengthen our approach for financial institutions. And finally, we have some projects that are in earlier stages in the scoping phase, including the accountability framework that will help standardize how SBTi assesses progress against targets and then will inform the requirements for monitoring, reporting, and verification of progress against targets. Also, critical guidance that we see for the correct implementation of targets in the corporate sector, including guidance on beyond value chain mitigation, and also enhanced guidance for aligning value chain targets with 1.5 degree scenarios and the net zero ambition. And then also work in the chemical sector and for insurance underwriting as an asset class. This is how our pipeline looks today, and you can find more information on these developments on our website. Back over to you, Luis.
Well, thank you very much, Alberto. So continuing with our three big priorities. You heard from me on institutional strength and from Alberto on achieving this technical completeness, with this idea that we need to get, as we go into more sectors, we get more specific and idiosyncratic. And we are going to be focusing on these activities to get more and more specific guidance for each of the most important sectors. Now, I want to present our last priority, leveraging the ecosystem. When SBTi was created 7 years ago, it was the new kid on the block. So we had to do a little bit of everything. Awareness raising, creating a movement, creating campaigns, advocacy on ambition, supporting for disclosure, you name it. Today, things have changed, and that's a good thing. There are many others in the ecosystem who are experts in specific areas. As I said, this is a good thing, and no one can solve the crisis alone. As part of this value chain is essential, they work as a machine to get ourselves to our goals. Or, as I like to call, there's 6 A's in corporate action ecosystem. First, we need accounting. No one, as I said, no one manages what it does not measure it. There's 100-year history in financial accounting. More than 2 million financial accountants in the world, and countless bachelor degrees in universities. A whole system was created to get the financial sector where it is today. We need that for carbon too. Working with likes of GHG Protocol, a long-term partner and collaborator, for example, is essential. We benefit from that work. We need disclosure as well. Work done by others like CDP are vital to bring transparency to this. And if done right, this can be boosted by the current regulation initiatives as well, such as SEC, ISSB, or IFRAG guidelines. We need accounting and we need disclosure. That helps the whole ecosystem. Second, then we move to activation. You need initiatives that are boosting, creating movements, getting folks started on the journey. We have long partners with the likes of Race to Zero, for example. Our work with Chile and then the UK as presidents of COP has been key to success, pushing corporate climate action further. We look forward for the great collaboration with Egypt and UAE moving forward as well. Then we need ambition. That's where we come in. That's as a third-party validation of that ambition. Seeing if targets align what is needed in accordance with the global models are telling us. But after that, we need action, implementation of these strategies. That's probably the most important thing to get us there. And there's a role for consultants and sector-specific initiatives that really focus on the how that action takes place, in line with the ambition that was defined. Supporting companies with their action plans and implementing their projects. That's about action. Then it comes back to progress reporting, to accountability, to show if ambition has been met. That is where we want to be able to do more with our progress framework. But let me be clear, without replicating the wheel and guaranteeing that we're leveraging what exists in terms of disclosure. We want to facilitate accountability. Finally, there's advocacy. The ones that will act on the information, including companies themselves, influencing and leveraging others to keep this machine moving, including policymakers, including their clients, including their suppliers, including their investees. We need this to keep this whole machine working to get to what we need. In a nutshell, we want to as SBTi, we want to double down on what we do best. We want to focus on delivering value where no one else does, and that is standardization of concepts, guidelines, ambition level aligned with what science tells us is needed. guaranteeing comparison, guaranteeing transparency, to avoid climate action to become a storytelling competition. Then we also want to help assessment and verification of that ambition, the accountability. We really consolidate ourselves as a market-based mechanisms to say if corporate ambitions are aligned with the science-based guidances. And we want to facilitate the accountability for that. We want to double down where we think our value is the greatest, and we want to leverage and support the work of others. We need to make this whole machine work. This is our last priority, leveraging the ecosystem. To conclude, we heard from where we were, we heard from where we are, and we heard from where we're going. But let's now take a step back. What is the path that needs to happen by corporate sector actors to leverage all of this framework, leverage all of this work, leverage all of this ecosystem to get us where we need it? So I've been saying that we have, first thing that our businesses need to have is a well-defined ambition. Where we want to get to, you need to have that. And that's what SBTi is really helping to deliver. Then you need to have a plan to really start delivering action to cut emissions. You must start delivering now and demonstrate progress. So have the plan is the first as today. Have the plan today for the next 7 years on how we're going to really deliver on these actions and cut emissions. Then you need a strategy and a plan on how you're going to do that by 2030, right? How the business will need to be adjusted and what needs to be done to get global emissions in line of what is our commitments in 2030. Finally, you need a vision and for 2025. So you do not make decisions today that go against that vision. So to summarize, have a clear ambition today, have a clear plan for the next 7 years, have a strategy for what needs to be adjusted after that. And for the very long term, have a vision. Even if you don't know exactly how you're going to get there, guarantee they're getting on the right path and they're not making decisions today that goes against that vision. I know that for business leaders and investors, it can be scary. I've sat on those chairs as there are difficulties and uncertainties on the long term. But on the short term, things are much clearer. We cannot slow down. We must accelerate, and you probably know what needs to be done on the shorter term. Remember when I said at first that I wasn't really meant to be here. I was starting to be an architect at the beginning of my career. I still love architecture. One of my favorite buildings is the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona. When Gaudí projected the Sagrada Familia and construction started, they had a clear path. They had a vision. They knew what they wanted to achieve. But the truth is, most of the technology was not there yet. Many of the construction techniques needed had not been invented before. And they started, they built the foundation, and they kept going. That's exactly the approach that we need right now. However, unlike Gaudí, we don't have 100 years to finish this project. Urgent and decisive action climate needs to be taken today. A few weeks back, I was at the World Economic Forum, and I heard a story about that when JFK made his famous speech about we want to get to the moon, not because it's difficult, but because it's hard. In 10 years, they also didn't have all of the technology to get there, right? And the interesting thing is that when they landed on the moon 9 years later, half of the engineers that were involved in the Apollo project were at high school when Kennedy set that ambition. So if you do set the ambition, if you do create the conditions, and if you start working on, we have a lot of people that are coming up to help us solve those challenges and get us to where we need. So have the plan, have the strategy for the medium, have the plan for the short term, have the strategy for the medium term, and really define the vision from the long term. I am personally committed, along with the rest of the fantastic SBTi team, to playing our part to help enable the decarbonization of companies and financial institutions across the world. We look forward to working with many of you on the call to do and to deliver this next step change that is needed. Now, as we went over this overview, right, I really wanted to bring to you this overview from where we were, where we are, and where we're going. But now I really want to get into time for us to answer questions. and turn this into a discussion. So let me turn to you, Lila, who'll be moderating our Q&A session today.
Thank you, Luis and Alberto, for this fantastic presentation, very comprehensive, and from the poll that we had earlier on, we know that many people were interested in learning about the upcoming changes, so we hope we've accomplished that. There have been many questions coming into the Q&A chat, about, I would say, 150 questions. Half of them have been responded to in the chat function already. The team is working to respond to the other half as well. We're recording all of the questions. There are a few interesting themes that are coming up, which I would like you to address. First, there are questions around the oil and gas sector and the upcoming guidance, and a request to understand what the status is in terms of SBTi and its position with this sector. When can we expect the guidance? This is obviously a very important sector to have on board with the decarbonization transition. So I'll pass it over to you to give some elements of response on oil and gas. Alberto, and then perhaps Luis, if you want to add too.
Yeah, maybe I can just quickly jump in and then pass on to Alberto. I just want to be clear on one thing. Oil and gas, we need to work and tackle with the oil and gas guidances, right? That's something that we will and will continue to do, and that's a top priority for us. What has happened is within our development process, there's the consultation period. And as you can imagine, during the consultation period, there was a lot of comments and suggestions that went from one side to the other side of the equation. So what we're doing is that we stopped the validation of those companies for a while this process is being defined, but that's a top priority in which we're working on, exactly to reevaluate all of those comments that were made. So to guarantee that we get this right, because it's so important and we're working tireless to get this right. So I'm pass on to Alberto to give you more details, but I just want to reassure that we will work with the oil and gas sector, and that's why we're taking the time to get this right.
Thank you, Luis. Yeah, no, I think just to reiterate, it's a process that is actively going on, and it was paused basically for two reasons. One of them was to address some of the key open questions that we found. It's a sector that we consider critical, and we want to make sure that we approach the sector with total confidence that the approach is the right one. And also because we were going through some changes in our framework, including the development of the net zero framework and the transition to 1.5 degrees. And it was important for us to consolidate those changes to then reflect those in the oil and gas guidance. And so that led basically to SBTi pausing work on this sector. And now we restarted work on this sector. Right now, working with a consultant that is helping us basically assess all these different changes that have come basically to have a path forward. And so, yeah, it's a reactive sector. And in the meantime, we have just passed commitments to basically make sure that companies are clear when they commit about what is expected from them, and to have full integrity from the commitment of companies to the target setting and target validation phase. So that's basically where we are, and yes, it's something that we'll be hearing more about in the coming weeks and months. And you can read basically all of these that we just described on our website in the sectoral development part in oil and gas.
Great, thank you both. So here's another question and another important topic that has come up. It's around offsets and removals and carbon credits. What is the SBTi's current position on those? What is the purpose, what is the objective for those, and what is the role of the offsets in achieving net zero goals? And do you see any changes in the future?
I'm happy to comment. And basically it's a reflection of what we have in the net zero standard, but also on what we are working on right now that is not reflected in the net zero standard that we call beyond value chain mitigation. And I would say the first thing that we need to keep in mind is what we need in order to reach net zero emissions globally is basically for most of the emission sources in the world to be phased out in the next 30 years. And so we need basically every company on the planet to embark on a decarbonization journey. And that's what science-based targets is about. And this is one of the key pillars of the Paris Agreement, right? We have mitigation as one of the key pillars, but we also have an immense finance gap that also needs to be financed and an adaptation gap, right? And we believe companies play a critical role, not only in reducing their own emissions, but also in enabling decarbonization in other parts of the economy. And they can do that by providing finance. And so that's basically the position that SBTi has adopted in the standard, which is to incentivize companies' own reductions within their value chain through the option of science-based targets, and to incentivize and to encourage companies to contribute to close the finance gap by encouraging companies to finance action beyond their value chains. And so what we are working on right now is basically more detailed guidance on how beyond value chain mitigation looks like, and then the different mechanisms that we believe are best practice for beyond value chain mitigation. And we expect these to become basically a guidance that will supplement our net zero standard. Now, there's one final element that I want to highlight, which is the removals part, which is, I would say, the last bit in the mitigation toolbox that will be necessary for those emissions that cannot be eliminated within value chains and beyond value chains. And so it is important for companies to plan also in the longer term, but it is something that will only be needed for those emissions that cannot be eliminated. And so that's basically how it is represented in our net zero standard. So that's our position today. We will expand on this position, and yeah, we will be sharing more updates in the coming months.
Great. Thank you for that, Alberto. We also have many more questions actually coming up through the Q&A box, and feel free to continue posting your questions. There are questions around monitoring and reporting and verification. If you could tell us about that. Another very specific question, so I'm just going to ask you two in one. A very specific question, which is about, do you have a sense of how many of the companies that you would like to have commitments and targets by 2025 will come from existing approved SBTs scope 3 targets? So that very specific question, and then if both of you could talk about the importance of verification, accountability, and what's in the pipeline on that.
Maybe I can just take the first step, Alberto, and then pass to you. So the first one, as I said, we want to focus on the piece of the ecosystem in which we think we bring the most value, which is really defining the ambition aligned with science, with the science, right? So developing the technical completeness that Alberto was mentioning to guarantee that we have the best-in-class guidance and standards for what science tells us with the key sectors. But we recognize that we also need to move a little bit onto the accountability side. And the MRV framework that Alberto mentioned is exactly an important part of that. Our progress report that we launched a few months back was again a first step towards that direction, because we recognize that from ambition, then you also need to move to accountability. We don't want to replicate the wheel. We don't want to do with what others do best, but we want to emphasize that we're creating the incentives and the structures and the due process to facilitate that accountability. And that is going to happen through this MRV framework that Alberto can talk about more.
Thank you, Luis. Yes, I think just provide a little bit more of context on how we see the evolution of this accountability function in the SBTi. As you know, today and in the past few years, focus has been on assessing and making sure that climate targets are consistent with best practice and with science and reflecting the criteria. For the past couple of years, we have been running our progress report. And in the progress report, we assess progress against targets, and we disclose this already as part of the progress report. But there's, I would say, a need in terms of defining and standardizing how progress is assessed, but also what is expected in terms of the metrics that should be used to report progress against targets. Also clarity in terms of how SBTi will assess progress against targets, and then what are the consequences of these targets being delivered or not, right? That level of clarity is what we want to basically represent in the MRV framework for science-based targets. And then we're gonna eventually incorporate this into our framework with the idea of, as we said, incentivizing delivery of targets and not only in limiting to the swing telecompetition, and also working with the wider ecosystem that of course play different roles in the accountability space. Lila, the other question was about...
The other question is about scope 3 and expectations of companies that will have targets by 2025.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I mean, we have, if you look at our progress report of 2021, we have already achieved, I would say, very good progress and very good coverage in Europe, in North America, in Japan, and I would say what we want to see growth happening now is particularly in developing countries and in hard-to-abate sectors, right? And those happen to be in the supply chain for most companies that have already set science-based targets. So we do believe that a significant portion of the growth that needs to happen in the coming years will come from companies working with their suppliers in setting science-based targets. This is one of the reasons why we are working on basically bringing more clarity about scope 3 target setting and net zero value chain alignment, because we think this is going to be a key mechanism to unlock further ambition in supply chains. And I would say this along with, of course, increased action from financial institutions as well. So these are what we expect to be the two main growth mechanisms.
Great, thanks for that. We're getting close to the end of the Q&A session, but there are two other interesting topics that have come up. One is around the link with the IPCC and how SBTi is using that as a foundation for its work. And the second topic that's coming up is reflection around the expected SEC regulation, upcoming regulation, and what impact it can have on companies setting science-based targets. So let's take these two questions, and after that we can go to closing remarks from Luis.
Alberto, would you like to take the first one? I can tackle the second one.
Yeah, happy to. So on the IPCC, basically since the special report on 1.5 degrees was released, we have taken as the basis to assess, basically, and to define ambition for science-based target setting using the different pathways that have been compiled by the IPCC. And that have been assessed by the IPCC. And so that is already the basis for what we do. Of course, now with the sixth assessment report being released, there's a new body of pathways. And so we are constantly reviewing these. And as part of our regular review of target setting resources, we expect to review against this new body of scenarios. Many of them are already included in what we do. So we don't expect really any significant changes in terms of the target setting parameters that are used today, but we will still make sure that it is basically including the latest scenarios. And yeah, that's my reflection on that point.
And when it comes to the SEC and other regulations, as you saw, there's an ecosystem in place, and those things we need to guarantee that they retrofit each other, because we need all of that to get to our objectives. So regulations around improving disclosure, they're welcome, right? We all need that. The whole ecosystem needs more and more disclosure, because again, if using using the example of the finance sector, it's because there's disclosures on balance sheets with 100 years of history of accountants doing that work, that we can create a good financial system that is standardized, that guarantees that the flow of information is going through, that guarantees that you can go there and actually evaluate how profitable a company is because you trust the information that was disclosed, and there's the whole system there. So we want that for carbon as well, right? So we encourage legislations and guidances that approve disclosure, because at the end, that provide disclosure, because at the end, that helps the whole ecosystem, but helps us as well to define if that disclosure is therefore aligned with ambition. So that's where we are not going to stop, is saying disclose. That's very, very welcome. We want that. We want then to see if that disclosure is aligned with the ambition of what is needed. And that's hence why SBTi is complementary to that, because we will keep watching and seeing and providing the guidances to guarantee that the ambition that is being disclosed is in line with what science is telling us that is needed.
Great, thanks, Alberto, Luis. Many more questions have come up through the chat, and our team is busy answering the more than 200 questions that have now been posed to all of you. So with that, I'm going to close the Q&A segment, and we're moving into closing remarks from Luis.
Well, thank you so much, Lila, Alberto. Thank you so much. I think it has been a very good event. Thank you so very much, mostly for all of the participants, and also for the SBTi army that you haven't seen behind this screen here, but they're working with to make this a success. So thank you so very much for our staff and our team working on it. Those were excellent questions. But again, this is the beginning, or the middle, but not the end of our process. Now, what I wanted to do, though, is to reflect on what we have covered today and look towards our shared future. You heard about SBTi history, about the outstanding last year and where we're heading. I talked to you about two key challenges we face as an organization as we move from a startup to a scale up on ambition and impact, and how we are overcoming them. I said to you three keys to unlock that growth: institutional strengthening, technical completeness, and leveraging of the ecosystem. I talked about the one big opportunity we must grasp to stop the clock on climate change, which is reaching this tipping point in which after that, everybody will join this party. This opportunity isn't just for SBTi. It's an opportunity for all of us. As I said, we were one piece of that machine, a very, very important one. Without it, the machine crumbles, but we are one piece. But maybe the opportunity isn't really the right word. Perhaps we should instead be talking about an imperative, because the world cannot afford to ignore it. As CEO of SBTi, I'm committed to delivering everything we talked about today. But I want you, the organizations we work with, to also commit to go faster with us. Because despite the pandemic, despite the war, this climate change is still happening. It is still the biggest threat we face. Together, we can make net zero science-based targets business as usual, with net zero standards for all of the sectors, guarantee there's clarity, there's standardization, so there's comparability, and we guarantee that there's no storytelling competition, but all of that is based on common understanding of what success looks like. Today, Lila, Alberto, and I have talked about our journey the SBTi has gone through. We've been about the challenges we face, and we have demonstrated our commitment to evolution and talked about what the bright future ahead we have if we all work together. We want you as partners and part of this future for the benefits of us and for all of the future generations. Thank you so very much.